Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony.
And I'm their friend and guest, Alan Singer.
Dr. Alan Singer, educator and historian, once again with us in the new year and helping us kick off the start of Black History Month. We're taping the Wednesday before our Monday airing and being brought to you by the good graces of EVT Educational Productions, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and Zoom. That's why you see us in these rectangles. We got a lot of stuff to try to cover, but we'll try to keep it in an organized manner. And one of the things, since it's Black History Month, is to take a look at what's been going on. I mean, we've covered critical race theory and the fight about teaching history, not just Black history properly, but interestingly enough, across the country, there've been a rash of crazy incidents that have occurred. I mean, I shouldn't say there's been a rash. Evidently, these are instances of things that just are ongoing across this country. I came across one that happened in DeLand, Florida, where some 58-year-old guy was upset by some teenagers in a car at a gas station. He went in the convenience store after yelling at them all kinds of crazy racist stuff. And then he took a pipe and smashed their window. They got scared. They called the cops, 911. Then they tried to drive away. He tried to stalk them in his car. And to make a long story short, they managed to get away from him. The cops caught up to him, found him. They put him under arrest, put him on $40,000 bail or whatever. He claimed that they had assaulted him. And the cops said, well, how come you didn't call 911? They did. So, I mean, it's funny, but it's not funny. These are young high school kids scared to death by some 58 crazy man because they were Black. And what's more egregious than that kind of crazy 58-year-old, 56-year-old white man is a bunch of high schoolers in Laguna Hills, California at a basketball game. They're playing this team, the Black kids at the foul line, and they start yelling things like, when did he escape from his slave owner? How did he get crazy racist stuff from the people in the stands at a Black basketball player, high school kid, Laguna Hills, California. So Florida to California, you name it, this craziness is going on across the board. So the fact that you can't teach the racist history that's prevalent in the historical arc of this nation so that people can understand why this is not good behavior today, we're relitigating stuff all over again. But we got some even bigger racial things to deal with on the larger platform, of which, what's the latest one that's in the ether, Bob? It is Brian Flores, right? Because his basic lawsuit is about racial discrimination in the NFL. Jump on that one for us.
Yeah, I mean, it comes up in the high media spotlight of the time between the last NFL conference championships and the Super Bowl, when everybody's eyes are right on the NFL. And Brian Flores, the former coach of the Dolphins, Black coach, sues the NFL, the Giants, the New York Giants, and the Denver Broncos. Not just, I'm sorry?
Did he sue the Dolphins also?
Yes, the Dolphins as well. And in not just a suit, but a federal class action suit, saying that Blacks have been stymied and blocked and discriminated against in their attempts to advance to head coaching and high-level positions in NFL football teams. And he goes on to describe his own issues with going to an interview and having the interviewers show up an hour late and seemingly unprepared and seemingly under the weather from a previous night of possibly drinking. And another instance where he was allegedly told to tank football games so that the company, the team would be in a better position for the draft. And
that's his former
finally,
team, the Dolphins, his former
the
team.
Dolphins, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, in the case of the New York Giants, which recently hired a new coach, Brian Daboll, a white man, but he's not saying anything about that coach. But he's saying that he notes that they had already apparently decided on Daboll, yet they still had Flores come in for an interview. And the way he knows that is because he got a text from his friend, Patriots coach Bill Belichick, which said, "Congratulations! I see you got the job." But apparently, the text was he misread his information and sent this text to Flores by mistake. So Flores basically knew he was going in to interview for what was already a done deal, which is his allegation in the lawsuit. So it's a nasty situation because of the NFL's long history of not promoting blacks, not hiring blacks. We can go back to, how long it took for the first black coach to the way it reacted when Colin Kaepernick took a knee in the 2015 season, and all of the ramifications from that. So it's a long simmering issue with the NFL and racism, which exploded with this class action suit filed this week.
On the first day of Black History Month, I believe, is when the suit was filed or announced, yes. Which I found quite interesting. But interestingly enough, on that first day of Black History Month, there came a rash of reports about bomb threats against historically Black colleges and universities. And lo and behold, after the stories came out, which I had not heard before, that there had been a series of similar bomb threats made about earlier in January. So this is not a one-off.
No, it's a second or third wave.
These Black colleges for the last 30 days, but they reiterated their threats again on February 1st. And so now from the president through the Justice Department, through local police departments, folks are, I presume, because in the halls of Congress, they're talking about who's taking care of this, who's looking into this. There's a caucus of historically Black colleges that's supposed to be a bipartisan caucus that's saying what's going on here? What's the Justice Department doing here? So, see, I'm actually relating all those early incidents I mentioned and this rash of bombings to this entire right-wing conspiracy that's been cooked up about critical race theory being the bugaboo for white grievances and white snowflake, I can't be hurt, I can't hear about my bad history kinds of stuff, oh, woe is me. Alan, you have something to say about this cabal of right-wing money people who have been behind this critical race theory. Drop us a little info on that before we move on to our next, would you? Because we've got another big racial thing to hit.
Well, it turns out that there's a foundation that has been funding nationwide all of these laws. And it's the Smith Foundation, some guys out of Florida. And the laws themselves all seem the same. And the reason they're all the same is they were drawn up by the Goldwater Institute in Arizona and promoted by the ALEC, the Koch brothers Foundation. Yeah. So what we have is really a nationwide effort to use opposition to critical race theory to steer up white anxiety, to get white people afraid and to get them to vote for right-wing causes.
Yeah, but they're now causing a whole wave of book bannings and crazy,
yes.
crazy laws that say you can't teach. There's an example about, you can talk about Jackie Robinson being the first Black player, but you can't talk about why Black people were banned from baseball. So what kind of education can you teach that way? As an educator, what kind of stupidity is that, Alan?
Look, there was a big incident in Texas where a young adult writer named Kraft, his books were banned by a school district near Austin. Mm-hmm. And because he wrote fictional accounts of his own children's experiences as Black kids at an overwhelmingly white school, mm-hmm. and how they constantly were really mistreated.
Mm-hmm.
And the books won national awards. And a white parent started a petition saying they made her kids uncomfortable.
Wow.
And the school banned it. Now, it was later rescinded because it was outrageous. But the American Library Association reports there are hundreds of books that are under attack in the United States, including books like Kill the Mockingbird.
Yeah, well, that was banned earlier, To Kill a Mockingbird. That came off the ban list. And now they prefer To Kill a Mockingbird because guess what? They use the N-word indiscriminately in To Kill a Mockingbird, but they're banning books because maybe somebody used the F word or some other, but it's okay to use the N-word. We won't put that on the ban list. But if we so much as use one curse word, then, oh, that's okay. We can let that one go. I find it totally crazy.
And then there was that graphic series, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, Alan, Mouse. I hate to call it a comic book because that's not, the intent. It's graphic serious. It's a serious, graphic novel. That's the proper term. Mm-hmm. And it goes into, it's a description of surviving the Nazis, basically. Mm-hmm. in comic graphic form, but
not the would-be wannabe neo-Nazis, the real Nazis that were murdering 6 million people. Yeah,
his
12 million, 6 million
concentration camps, and it's really the story of his father, and he's trying to come to terms with his father's life. One of the things that happened, and that this week it was on, I believe it was on Monday, on the ABC TV show,
The View.
They were discussing book banning, and they were focusing specifically on Kill the Mockingbird and Mouse, and how school districts wanted to ban Mouse supposedly because of nudity, because a lot of dead nude bodies were drawn in.
Wow.
What happened?
Nude bodies we can't see. Okay.
Now, what happened during the discussion, Whoopi Goldberg was explaining why it was so important that young people read books like Mouse and understand the Holocaust. But in the discussion, she argued that the Holocaust and Mouse was not about race. It was about how humanity is treated. And she argued that race wasn't a factor. Now, what happens is a couple of the other people said, no, it was. And because she argued that this was not about race, Whoopi Goldberg was suspended for 2 weeks from The View. And I don't believe that they would have done that to a white person. Now, Whoopi Goldberg, she was incorrect. She was incorrect because she didn't know much about the history of Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, in their ideology, they argued that Jews were a separate race.
Correct.
And therefore, this was racial cleansing. But what is even more important to note, Nazi Germany based its racial laws on Jim Crow laws in the United States and on the one drop of blood. If you were one drop of black blood, you were black. So the racism expressed in Hitler's memoir, Mein Kampf, and then the Nuremberg laws were drawn directly from racial laws in the United States.
Yeah, but you can't teach that in the United States, Alan. At least in Texas and a bunch of other places, can you?
No, Whoopi Goldberg, she was mistaken because the Nazis, it was specifically about race, mistaken concept of race. But this is something that should have been discussed. She should not have been made to apologize. This should have become a learning moment for the nation. And instead, they use it to silence her. And I thought she was wronged.
She was wrong about the racial thing, and she was wronged, WRONGED, by what they did on her. And I believe her apology was, I apologize for my ignorance and not knowing. And I'm sorry I hurt folks because I didn't know enough. And she apologized like 3 times to say, and out of it, I've actually learned a heck of a lot more than I knew before I started on this discussion. And you're right. I don't think she should have been suspended because of the ignorant comment that she made, because it was in the service of talking about man's inhumanity to man. She was talking about the fact that the Nazis were crazy homicidal, genocidal, because they were trying to eradicate a race of people, maniacs who should have been brought to trial and should have been prosecuted. And I believe that was the thrust of her argument in the discussion.
And I think part of the problem is that people thought that she was taking it lightly because she said something to the effect that this is white people on white people. And so, you know, people might have, well, it sounded glib and people were offended by that alone. But I agree with you, Alan. She was wrong in her description. She was showing a bit of ignorance of the subject, and it should have been a teachable moment that we could have talked about and learned from. But it's network TV, and optics are everything. I mean, so a suspension makes the network look good, and that's what happened here.
Now, I watched the tape on YouTube, and I have to say, I thought she did a very effective job arguing that children needed to learn about these things and arguing against efforts to ban Mouse and efforts to ban the Holocaust. Now, Whoopi Goldberg is an African-American woman who identifies as a Jew. I also identify as a Jew, an Eastern European Jew. And I have to tell you, I have family members who died in the Holocaust. I did not find what she said to be offensive at all. I was not insulted by Whoopi. I was insulted by the silencing of Whoopi.
Yeah, it's politically correct, cancel culture, whatever they're calling these things when they bend over backwards and go too far the wrong way. I find that disingenuous, is that the right word? And I find it sometimes quite hypocritical. And speaking of hypocritical, that's a good segue to move to our next section, because Alan, talk to us about all this hypocrisy and hypocritical hand-wringing and supposed craziness coming from Ted Cruz and Susan Collins and all these crazy Republicans responsible for putting unfit people like Brett Kavanaugh and possibly unfit people like, untutored enough like Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court, while they're preconditioning us to want to believe that any Black woman would be totally inferior. Jump on that one for us.
Well, Joe Biden made a political decision during the campaign. He made a promise that he would nominate a Black woman for the Supreme Court, a qualified Black woman for the Supreme Court. Now, what happened is the right-wing media is now screaming that this is reverse discrimination. And ironically, I think I saw this on Trevor Noah, tapes of Ronald Reagan talking about how he was going to put a woman on the Supreme Court, and how Donald Trump was saying how he was going to put a woman on the Supreme Court.
A particular woman who was going to overturn Roe v. Wade. Okay.
Now, it was okay for them to put a woman on the Supreme Court because they were white women. But to suggest a Black woman, that's reverse discrimination. Now, one of the commentators from the right, and we won't mention Voldemort's name, said, well, the Black women only make up like 1/6 of the 1/20th of the population of the United States. And to put them on the court, they would now be 1/12, and that's unjustified. And I think it was Charles Bull in the Times said, there have been 200 Supreme Court justices. There hasn't been one Black woman. So far, they have zero representation. And so it's just become ridiculous. I'd like to make a couple of comments just about the history of the Supreme Court.
Please do.
Now, except for a short span from 1935 to 1970, the Supreme Court of the United States has always been an instrument of conservative power and has been fundamentally undemocratic. The court's role is actually very ill-defined in the Constitution. It was set up as an independent branch of the federal government, and it was assigned what they called the judicial power, but there was never a set number of judges and no clear responsibility. At one point, the court claimed that it would decide whether a law was consistent with the Constitution. But for the first 50, 60 years of the country, they were only involved in minor cases. The big issue was slavery. Because in the 1850s, the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision decided that by a 7-2 vote, it ruled that African Americans had no legal right in the United States because the founders had not included them in the category of citizen. So from that point, I mean, that, although I think all 7 of them were slaveholders.
No kidding.
Now, after the Civil War, the Supreme Court was involved for the next 60 years in gutting the civil rights of African Americans, in undermining the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. It accepted disenfranchisement of Black men. It accepted Jim Crow. It wasn't until the 1930s, when FDR and his successor, Harry Truman, were president for 16 years, that we began to get a Supreme Court that respected human rights. And even in the 1950s, Republican Dwight Eisenhower, he was willing to appoint moderate judges. But since 1968, the Republicans have concentrated on appointing right-wing activist judges, 3 by Donald Trump. And these activist judges have no commitment to law, they have no commitment to legal precedent, and they should never have been appointed to the court. They are committed to reversing decisions that limited the power of corporations to influence elections. They want to reverse protection for women and minority groups, and they want to reverse protection for voting rights. Right now, there is one conservative judge on the Supreme Court, Justice Roberts, who actually respects legal precedent.
Alan, I'm going to take issue with you on Justice Roberts being a moderate judge on the Supreme Court.
Well, conservative.
My take on Roberts is he's the Chief Justice. He's the guy who really shepherds most of this stuff in, even though he pretends to try to be even-handed. That's my take on Roberts, but you can keep your belief on him all you want. Go ahead.
There are 2 moderate justices now, Kagan and Breyer, who's resigning. There's one liberal justice, and I think we need to give credit. She's from the Bronx, Sonia Sotomayor. And as far as I can tell, she is the only one on the Supreme Court of the United States currently who fights to extend democratic rights, civil rights, human rights. This court is not a Supreme Court of the United States, it's a Supreme Court of white supremacy and turning back the clock.
Sotomayor is not trying to push Democratic Party rights. You're talking small d democratic government kinds of rights. I don't want our viewers to think that she's a partisan hack, but she's a human rights, serious fighter for human rights.
And she's from the Bronx.
Yeah, that's right. Justice for all the people, equally. That's what she's for, from what I've seen.
And then you have Clarence Thomas, who's just occupying a seat.
Yeah, don't let me get started on Clarence Thomas, Bob, because you know he comes from my alma mater, and I really want to just almost do some bad things, but I can't say that publicly. But I would like to disown him from my school. But anyway,
well, again, what's very, very clear: the Republicans have used the Supreme Court appointees to block democracy in the United States. And in my view, any vote for a Republican candidate is a vote to block democracy. And I just can't interpret it any other way.
I mean, you're talking about this current Republican Party in this current iteration. The old Republican Party that actually had moderates that actually worked across the aisle no longer exists. And so I agree with you that if you vote for any Republican person that's currently in any of these Congresses nationally and actually statewide, because ALEC, that group you were talking about, that was part of the CRT people, they have stacked the state legislatures to the point where Republican hacks are been trying to gut the voting system. They're the ones in Republican legislatures that are passing the rights to destroy women's rights, voting rights, So actually your blanket statement is accurate. I shouldn't even try to modify it. These people are anti-democratic government, period.
Two of my favorite Supreme Court justices were Republicans. I want to say that. Earl Warren actually was the Republican governor of California, and he was the Republican candidate for vice president in 1948. And Earl Warren, and when he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he recognized that human rights were crucial to democracy in the United States. And my other favorite justice is William Brennan, who was a Republican from New Jersey. And Brennan, who was a moderate, but what Brennan said, and I think is very important, we don't interpret it, the Constitution, it's a living document. We don't interpret it as if we were living in 1787. We have to interpret it as modern people in a modern era, so we can address modern issues.
Yeah.
And they were both Republicans of a very different era.
Yeah, it was.
Let me just give us a 2-minute warning.
Yeah, it was the Warren Court and Brennan who actually helped to move that previous Supreme Court's predilection against democracy back towards true government for the people, of the people, by the people. In the last minute and 30 seconds or whatever it is, we have to tell our viewers that the January 6th probe has moved into high gear, which we said the last show. But one of the key things is they are now into the room and gotten the documents where they can see where the former president, the guy whose name we try not to use, that Stephen Colbert also tries not to use, actually was complicit in trying to deal with getting those fake slate of electors to be recognized. And the January 6th probe was subpoenaed 14 of those fake electors. And there are any number of other people that have been called and have actually started to testify. I think Pence's right-hand guy, what's his name? Jacobs, I think that's his name. Jacobs is Pence's one. Benny Powell, the chairman of the commission, said that's a patriotic man who actually cares for this country. So they're getting information, folks. And hey, we'll keep our fingers crossed that we're actually going to get to the bottom of this. And if they funnel all the stuff that they're finding to the prosecutor in Atlanta, Georgia, I think the Orange Julius guy may actually go down in flames, if not nationally, locally. That's why he's talking about racist prosecutors in Atlanta asking the people to get to the streets.
And we're just about, and yes, we're just about there.
This has been Media Watch, folks. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony. Catch up to us on Twitter and YouTube at Media Watch EVT.
And I'm their friend and guest, Alan Singer. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again, Alan. Appreciate it, folks. We'll catch you the next time. Stay safe. The pandemic is still with us.